This conference will now be recorded.
So again, welcome to the 2022 Dam Safety and Floodplain Management Grant Workshop. This is the final offering of the virtual floodplain management session. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to receive this information and ask that our participants please introduce yourselves in the chat. You can click on the speech bubble in the toolbar and that'll open up the chat, and you please put your name there. My name is Angela Davis. I am the NFIP State Coordinator and Lead Floodplain Planner at DCR. And if our other DCR staff could please take a moment to introduce yourselves.
Hi, and good morning, everybody. My name is Brandy Buford, and I am a floodplain program planner here with DCR.
Hello, this is Matt Allen, Program Manager for the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan, listening in. Thanks. Hi, everyone.
Thank you, Brandy and Matt. Wendy Howard Cooper will also be joining us today, and she is the Division Director for both the Dam Safety and Floodplain Management Program. I'm now going to pass it over to Debbie Messmer from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management to kick off our discussion on recovery and mitigation.
Good morning, everyone. I am about to share my screen. There we go. Thank you, Brandy. Good morning, everyone. I am Debbie Messmer. I am the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, and I am going to do a general overview of public assistance and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And at the end, I would appreciate any comments, questions, concerns. What about these types of things, so that we can work through this, through any issues that you guys might have in the future with public assistance and HMGP. So I'm just going to start off the process talking about kind of the beginning to the end, or beginning to the declaration, so that you guys can have a foundation as to where this will lead. So on the next slide, you'll see, actually, let's go to the next slide first. So what is the Public Assistance Program? So the Public Assistance Program basically provides assistance to local, state, and tribal governments, certain private nonprofits, for disaster-related activities performed during or after a presidentially declared disaster. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process for public assistance and what it means and how to apply for it. I'm going to talk in terms of a recent disaster that we had, disaster 4628, which was a landslide flooding incident in Buchanan County, specifically really centralized in the town of Hurley. So if I speak in terms of an example, I'll be speaking in terms of this specific example. So really what public assistance is to help local government be recouped for costs that they spend in response and in cleanup to a disaster. So now let's go back here one more slide, and let's talk about how you get to either a state or a federal disaster declaration. So we have an event. So let's take the landslide flooding incident in our event in Buchanan County. So that event occurred. What we do initially is VDEM conducts initial damage assessment. So we reach out through our regional offices. We reach out to the local governments to try to get just initial damage assessments. What's going on? What's the damage out there that's occurred so far? What have you guys spent on response to those damages? What are we looking at? Are we going to reach a threshold? And threshold is the key word there. So every disaster event has a threshold that we have to meet in order to look at a federal disaster declaration or a state disaster declaration. So for example, let's just take the snowstorm that just happened last week. Actually, that's not really a good example because we have to meet a threshold for a snow disaster with an amount of snow. But let's just say that it was just a disaster, a flooding disaster. Each locality has to submit their damages so that the total that we're receiving meets this per capita threshold that FEMA has established. So for the state of Virginia, all of the damages associated within the incident period has to total $14 million. If we don't hit around $14 million in the first, well, initially we're just trying to, I'm sorry, let me back up. Initially we're just trying to get a gauge on how much damage is out there. So we're collecting the damage assessments, we're seeing what they are. Then we look at to see, are we going to have enough to conduct a joint damage assessment? So if we do, then we reach out to FEMA, to SBA, and we work together with them to see if we're going to have enough. Then they come out and we actually do a preliminary damage assessment. I apologize. So the preliminary damage assessment is where we work with the local governments, with FEMA, to try to meet that threshold of $14 million. So we're collecting documentation, and we have 30 days to collect that documentation to send it up to FEMA to request our presidential declaration if we're going to have it. So once we have conducted the damage assessment, we review all the documentation. We see, hey, we met the $14 million threshold. We go to the governor. We request the governor request a federal declaration. So they go to FEMA. So the governor sends a letter to FEMA, and FEMA makes a recommendation to the president, and the president makes a determination. So as I stated, there is this $14 million magical number, and that is the total dollar amount that the state as a whole has to reach before we can ask for a presidentially declared disaster. If we do reach that amount, each locality, each county or city has their own threshold that they have to meet in order to be included in that presidentially declared disaster. So it is based on the population of the county. So for example, in the town of Buchanan County itself could have reached that, or did reach that amount. But let's say a contiguous county also applied or also wanted to be included in the presidentially declared disaster. If their county population was 5,000 people, there's a $4 per person per capita amount that they have to reach. So they had to have at least $20,000 worth of damage in order to be included in the presidentially declared disaster. So that's how the presidentially declared disaster works. So let's say we didn't get the presidentially declared disaster. Then there's thresholds that each locality has to meet in order to get a state declared disaster. So we have both of those opportunities there. So talking about roles and responsibilities within the public assistance program, really starting with the potential applicants. So that's the local roles. So the counties, the cities, the towns, the school districts, the special districts, all of those are the potential applicants. And their role is the largest. They have to identify damage. They have to describe the impact for their locality or their structures. They are going to be the ones who lead the teams around. They're providing all the information, insurance information, cost information. They're the ones that are doing all of the work. So the state and FEMA are gathering that information and passing it on to the appropriate people. So for the state roles and responsibilities, we have to submit the request to FEMA for a joint preliminary damage assessment. We also have to provide the initial damage assessment, which is what's done in that first week and a half or so. And then we have to coordinate to get all those site visits and damage assessment data collection completed. So FEMA comes in, and they're really the expertise in the area for public assistance. They assist us with developing reports and the assessments, but they're really there to answer questions. Is this the kind of stuff that's eligible? That sort of thing. So there's different types of eligible applicants, sub-applicants, or applicants. Sorry, in mitigation we call them sub-applicants. In PA we call them applicants. So types of eligible applicants is actually based on, this is a slide like at the national level, so some of these things we don't actually have in Virginia, some of these entities. But first of all, state agencies. State agencies are eligible. Local governments, counties and cities and towns, local public authorities, local schools, school districts, state and regional agencies, instrumentalities of local government. So planning district commissions, water authorities, co-ops, electrical co-ops, all of those are eligible applicants. In addition, federally recognized Indian tribes are eligible applicants. And then there's certain private nonprofit entities that have a critical or essential function that can be eligible as well. And we would say maybe volunteer fire departments or the entities that are nonprofits, but they're serve a critical or essential function. So non-critical PMPs are also eligible potentially, but they're required to first work through the Small Business Administration to take out loans in order to fix their damage. Then if things aren't covered by SBA, then they're potentially eligible for public assistance funding. So when we, so we start the process, we've gone through the initial damage assessment, we've gone through the preliminary damage assessment, we've requested the presidential declaration, and that's been awarded. And now we're going to start actually trying to get these applicants their money, basically, help them recover. So we start with the pre-award, where the applicants work with the state and FEMA to develop the award package. So they have a project, we're trying to develop this project. FEMA goes through the awarding process with that project, and then they give the state the funding to pay that project worksheet is what it's called, to pay that project out. There's a significant amount of documentation that is required. Typically it involves invoices, proof of payments, anything timesheet related, if there's protective services or protective measures that were done with people. So once all that documentation is done, FEMA then performs, if necessary, some sort of audit to make sure at the grant closeout level to make sure that everything was done in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations. So that's kind of the basics on the public assistance process, and I will reiterate the fact that the public assistance is not what I do. I can, like I said, give a basic description on that. What I do is hazard mitigation. So I can answer basic questions on public assistance, certainly if there are any. But in terms of hazard mitigation, I do run the hazard mitigation program here, and when there's been a presidentially declared disaster, there is 15% of the funding that's given to the Commonwealth for public assistance. 15% of that amount is then given to us to run our hazard mitigation program. So really, we're looking to provide funding to state agencies, to local governments, to tribes, so that they can rebuild in a way that reduces or mitigates future disaster losses in their community, and to help them respond and kind of mitigate what the damages that have already occurred because of this event. So just to be clear, homeowners and businesses and homeowners and businesses cannot apply directly to VDAM for hazard mitigation. They do have to go through their local community to apply, but a local government can apply, as all the way down from county, cities to towns can apply, and including planning district commissions. So what types of things do we look at for hazard mitigation? So of that 15% of funding that we get, we break it up into 3 pots of money. First, we have 7% of the funding we use for planning related activities directly related to the hazard mitigation plan. So mostly we look at hazard mitigation plan updates, which hazard mitigation plans are required across the Commonwealth in order to receive mitigation funding and in order to receive other funding that is related to the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So it is important to have an updated hazard mitigation plan and with certain strategies written into the plan, and Wendy's going to talk a little bit more about that. We also have 5% of our funding is pushed towards initiative projects. We look at initiative projects as types of projects that you cannot quantify the benefit cost analysis on. So, which normally most projects require a benefit cost analysis. So these initiative projects are projects like warning systems, education and outreach, generator quick connects, those types of projects. FEMA has not determined a way to conduct a benefit cost analysis on, so we can't really quantify the benefits. So we have a small pot of money where we can work on those types of projects. And lastly is our structural projects. That's kind of the meat of what we do. 88% of our funding we can set aside at a minimum. 88% of our funding we can set aside for structural projects, and we could do anything from acquisition, elevation, relocation for private property or business owners. We could do stormwater management projects. We do any sort of drainage, floodplain restoration, generator projects. So all of those can fall into the structural mitigation project type as well. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and either take questions or turn it over to Wendy, and then we can take questions at the end. I'll let Wendy determine how that happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Next slide, please. We'll go ahead and talk about this particular piece of the hazard mitigation planning, and then we can take additional questions. Bear with us as we get these other slides up. Thank you, Brandy. Okay, to piggyback on some of the things that Debbie was talking about, particularly the need for the hazard mitigation plan, the local hazard mitigation plan, and the things that need to be in it, I wanted to speak specifically about the need to have all dam risk in your hazard mitigation plan. This has not been something that all communities have done. As part of the package that will come after this presentation, you'll get a list of all the dams in the Commonwealth on one sheet, and then on the other tab it'll have it broken out by community, so you can click the total on your community and get a separate sheet to show up with your information only, or you can filter on the other sheet. You're also going to get a copy of the section of the hazard mitigation plan at the state level that relates to dam risk. And what we're asking folks to do is adopt by reference that chapter of the state hazard mitigation plan. And then in your local hazard mitigation plans, also add your list of dams from the spreadsheet that is being provided. And that's all dams, not just high hazard dams. But we want to specifically identify all the dams in your community that are poor, unsatisfactory, or have an unknown condition assessment, because these tend to pose a greater risk to the public and are most likely going to be the target of mitigation efforts. So we want to make sure that we identify them. We also want to identify any dams that are currently under rehabilitation or dams that could be removed. And as we talk about this, and we're going to go into the CFPF conversation shortly, but some of these efforts can be leveraged against the hazard mitigation plan and the CFPF because it is a flood protection measure to either rehabilitate or remove a dam. So just keep that in mind as we move through this process. Next slide, please. All right, we want to make sure that in your plans that you also add a strategy, or at least the potential strategy, and a commitment to work with private dam owners in the rehabilitation of their dams. And that means that the locality may either be a fiscal agent that passes through the funds to the dam owner, or in some cases, they're actually overseeing the work. In Virginia, more than 50% of dams are privately owned. And most of our federal funding, well, all of our federal funding at the current time, and some state funding cannot flow directly to a private dam owner. And we're going to have to rely on the local governments to actually help us move this money into those communities to repair or remove these dams. You all are probably aware and have heard about the infrastructure bill that was passed and the billions of dollars that are coming for dam safety. We will not be able to access those dollars if we don't have certain things in place that allows us to push that money to the communities. So it's really important that you all get this information into your hazard mitigation plans, that you think and really consider how you can be the conduit to help us help these local privately owned dams get the mitigation funds that they need to get these dams repaired. It is really a public safety issue. I know a lot of people say, well, they're privately owned and we shouldn't, but this is more of a public safety issue, especially around high hazard dams. And that's where we would prioritize funding, because if a high hazard dam fails, people will die. People's property will be destroyed. That is why it's rated high hazard. So we want to make sure that we are positioning ourselves in the best possible way to not only receive money, but primarily to reduce the risk of flooding and life loss. And just a final note about this topic, you really cannot have a whole community resilience strategy if you're not considering the impacts of flooding from dam failures. So we're talking about sea level rise and stormwater infrastructure and all of those things, but a catastrophic dam failure can do more damage because you don't have time to prepare. We have a dam failure situation happening right now, and we have people evacuated from their properties. And this is what we call a sunny day failure, because it was a failure within the dam. It wasn't related to a storm event. We have to be cognizant of the risk to flooding in these communities if there is a dam. So just wanted to let you all know that it's so important providing the information out so you can put this information in your plans. I'm your resource if you have questions or need assistance with that. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Happy to be with you this morning. My name is Rich Saboda. I'm with the FEMA Region 3 office in Philadelphia. I've been with them since 2008, most of that time as their insurance specialist. I want to start by thanking the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation for hosting me this morning. I also want to thank Angela Davis for doing most of the heavy lifting to get me here with you. And most of all, I'd like to stop and thank each and every one of you for sharing some of your time with me today. I'll try to make that time worth your while. I'm going to go off camera and so you can concentrate on the slide presentation. I'll come back on after we're done. All right, very good. Sorry, I'm not real familiar with GoToMeeting. The topic this morning is Risk Rating 2.0. The Risk Rating 2.0 bottom line is the newly introduced rating methodology for the National Flood Insurance Program. For background information, the National Flood Insurance Program has been around for over 50 years at this point. As we are here today, we probably have about 5 million policies in force throughout the United States and its territories, which makes us, I believe, the biggest property insurer in the nation. For most of the time that we've been in existence, we've used a rating system, which I'll spend a little time describing this morning, but we can refer to that system as the legacy system. The legacy system, as we will see, is a class rating, zone rating type of system, whereas Risk Rating 2.0 takes a much more individualistic approach. The legacy system has served us well for quite a while, but it's developed some problems over time, and one of the reasons, of course, that we're replacing that system is really to come into the 21st century. So the legacy system kind of got us out of whack when it comes to policy rating, and our new system, Risk Rating 2.0, will serve us to reflect much more accurately flood risk, and therefore allow us to come up with much more accurate premiums for each structure we insure. And again, all of these rates will be specific to each individual property, its geographical location, its building characteristics. So we will indeed be providing each and every one of our policyholders with their own individual rate based on our methodology here and some rating variables that I'll be going over a little bit later on. The timing of this introduction of Risk Rating 2.0 has already started. We began using this new system October 1st of last year for all new business policies, and that's going on pretty smoothly as far as I can see. We will begin to use these rates in this new system for our existing policies as they renew on or after April 1st of this year. If you have a moment, we're kind of interested in knowing what your background is. If you can drop notes into the chat. Are you aware of this new system already? How often does flood insurance come up in your day-to-day work? And how prepared do you feel to speak with residents, community leaders, and others about the National Flood Insurance Program? Thank you. So let's talk about the NFIP today. It's a system where we do provide flood insurance coverages to people who wish to purchase it, and we think it's a real good idea to purchase flood insurance. And here's one of the reasons why. We'll take a look at flooding events that occurred in Richwood, West Virginia, and also in Virginia Beach, both of those a few years ago. What we found after the fact was for those policyholders, or those people who did have flood insurance policies when those events occurred in West Virginia, as you can see over on the left-hand side, the average payout through our flood insurance program was $48,000 per property, and that is as compared to the $7,500 individual assistance award average, and those awards are given for making basic repairs to the structure that's been damaged by flood. Well, the funds may help to make that structure more habitable. It's certainly not going to bring the structure anywhere near what it used to be in the past. So as you can imagine, that $48,000 comes in and goes a lot further for that purpose. So there's about a $40,000 difference between those two categories. The Hurricane Matthew on the right-hand side, again, average claim payout $35,000 for that event, and that's as compared to the average individual assistance award of $4,000. So again, about a $30,000 difference there. It's important to remember that after a flooding event occurs, in order for disaster assistance to be made available through the federal government, there needs to be a presidential disaster declaration. And while that is relatively common, it does not happen as a response to each and every flooding event. And when that flooding event is not presidentially declared, there is no federal disaster assistance available. Those blue boxes for individual assistance would not be there at all if these events were not presidentially declared. Taking a look at the history of flooding events in Virginia, you can see NOAA provided us with some storm events data for Virginia since the 1960s. And as you can see, all across Virginia, flooding has happened. In some cases, flooding events have been more frequent than others, but I can tell you on the basis of my experience that there is no such place as a place that cannot flood. We like to say these days that anywhere it can rain, it can flood. And we found that to be true over time. Just another incentive for people to look into the purchase of flood insurance. We are, of course, very interested in seeing how many people in any given area purchase flood insurance versus how many people are in that area, and we call that penetration rate. So you're looking at the penetration rate for the entire Region 3, if you can mentally block off just the Virginia areas there. But long story short, as you can see, around the Chesapeake Bay, there are a number of areas where the penetration rates are quite high. But for the most part, through the rest of the state, percentage or penetration rates are really very low. And of course, we're trying to increase those whenever we can. We are in the process of doing what we are referring to as a NFIP moonshot. And the purpose of that moonshot is to double the number of structures that are being insured for flood over the course of a certain period of time. So we're hard at work on that one. The image that you're looking at this point really kind of gives you some idea of the basis of our legacy system rating, and this is kind of a representation of the flood insurance rate maps or firms that we have been using to depict areas of risk and also to determine flood insurance premiums. And you can see the different shaded areas there. And depending upon where a structure is located relative to those shaded areas, that would determine, for the most part, what the premium would be for that structure. But again, it's a zone rating, it's a category class type of rating. To explain the different shaded areas, the light gray areas are considered to be areas that are outside of the special flood hazard areas or outside of the highest risk areas for flooding. So we have found over time that people who discover that their properties are located in those areas think that they don't need to worry about flooding, don't need to purchase flood insurance, when the sad fact is a a pretty strong percentage of flood losses that we've had in the history of the program have actually occurred in those areas. They continue to occur. If you think back a few years, that event that affected Houston, Texas, very, very, very heavy rainfall event occurring over a relatively short period of time, inundated that entire area, and most of that area was actually light gray on our map. So that'll give you some idea of what we are trying to accomplish by using our new rating system, as we'll explain in a minute. The brownish or tannish areas are areas of moderate risk, and the blue shaded areas or the cross-hatched areas are areas that are considered to be of the highest risk for flooding. But again, floods can and do happen everywhere. And yes, we do sell flood insurance policies in any of those areas. Anyone who owns a property can purchase flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, with very few exceptions. And so we encourage people to look at the purchase of flood insurance if they don't already have the policy. The blue shaded areas, sometimes referred to as the special flood hazard areas, or SFHA, those areas are there to depict the 1% annual chance of flooding, or as it's also sometimes called, the 100-year floodplain. The term 100-year floodplain, unfortunately, is somewhat misleading. People think that it's an event that can only happen once every 100 years, and unfortunately, that is not the case. While there's a 1% annual chance in any given year, that 1% annual chance exists year to year to year. And you can have situations where back-to-back 1% annual chance events occur in given areas. So the terminology and some of the other information associated with our flood insurance rate maps, unfortunately, has resulted in some confusion out there, and that's another reason why we're undertaking Risk Rating 2.0. And yes, this is an absolute transformation of the National Flood Insurance Program. I've been supporting the NFIP in one form or another since 1993. And I can tell you that this is just the most exciting period of time for the National Flood Insurance Program in terms of the advances that we're making. A couple of years back, we came up with a new policy system which contains all of our records, takes care of any policy transactions, et cetera, and that system, it's called the Pivot system, is just absolutely serving us very well at this point, and provides us with nearly real-time data. And in addition to that, the other major transformation ongoing is Risk Rating 2.0. Why are we undertaking this? In addition to the reasons I've already cited, FEMA does have a mandate to make sure that our rates are sound and that we clearly communicate risk. And as we'll see when we look more closely at rating, not all of our rates have been accurate over time. And as I mentioned, the flood insurance rate map that we just looked at does not really clearly communicate the details of risk. So we're going to do it a little bit of a different way under Risk Rating 2.0. We also, over time, have developed some inequities in the rating system. And this all comes down to the fact that our legacy system did not consider replacement cost value of the homes that we were insuring. And as a result of that, the owners of older, what we call pre-firm homes, were actually subsidizing the owners of the newer, more expensive post-firm homes. And again, that came up as a result of the rating system that we were using, and Risk Rating 2.0 will begin to address those inequities. Last but not least, we are mandated to make sure that our books are financially resilient, that we are charging proper rates, and that we're not going too deeply into debt. And so Risk Rating 2.0 is aimed to make sure that we are situated on a path going forward that is going to be financially resilient for the National Flood Insurance Program. Side-by-side comparison of how the legacy or existing rating methodology works versus the Risk Rating 2.0 methodology. Under the existing rating methodology, we have always used FEMA-sourced data, and the flood insurance rate map that we looked at is a classic example of FEMA-sourced data. It was derived over time through surveys, through LIDAR runs, through other means, and all that information was then transmitted into the community's flood insurance rate maps. And as we've seen in the flood insurance rate maps, there are different zones of risk that are depicted. And in some cases, in the high risk areas, there is something provided called the base flood elevation, or BFE. Base flood elevation is just another way of saying how high we anticipate water will rise during a flooding event. And obviously that's a pretty important piece of information to know. If you know how high water likely will rise, if you know what the lowest floor is of the structure that you are insuring, you can compare those two and come up with a pretty accurate assessment of what the risk is and what the premium rate should be. We're taking a different approach again under Risk Rating 2.0. More on that in a minute. Foundation type under the legacy system always in part drove what the rates would be, and again, we're taking a little bit of a different approach under Risk Rating 2.0. The structural elevation, again, is the key factor for the most part in the legacy system within the special flood hazard areas. Outside of the special flood hazard area, pretty much rates determined by past experience and our best guesses, quite honestly. But again, it was all based on the 1% annual chance or the 100-year event. And this being a federal program, there are certain fees and surcharges that are built into our rating. Over on the right-hand side, you can see that we will continue to use FEMA-sourced data, and over time, we have amassed a mountain of data relative to mapping, relative to topography, relative to flood loss data, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to that, we've gone to other governmental agencies, since they have also worked in the mapping process and have a lot of useful data available to us. So agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, USGS, et cetera, all of them had a lot to offer to us, and we're taking advantage. In addition to that, the commercial sector has come up with an awful lot of information over time, which is helpful in determining flood risk and therefore flood premiums. So we've gone out into the commercial sector to purchase some of that information. As I mentioned before, the cost to rebuild will now be a part of our rating system, and that will make a pretty significant difference, as we'll see in a moment, in property owners' rates. In terms of rating variables, we're now looking at the distance of the structure to any flooding source, whether it be the coast, the ocean, river, et cetera, the river class that's involved, which I'm not going to explain right at the moment, the flood type that is likely to occur in those areas, and for the most part, legacy system looked in the fluvial risks that were involved, which is pretty much your standard dry land being inundated with rising water type of situation. But we also are now taking into account those rainfall events, as I described in Houston a few years ago, and that's called the pluvial risk. So risk rating 2.0 will reflect both fluvial and pluvial risks. Ground elevation continues to be an important factor once we know the elevation of the area where the structure is located and the elevation of the surrounding area. If that structure is found to be up on a little rise or hill, it tells us one thing versus if the structure is in a small depression in the ground, that's going to tell you something totally different about flood risk and likelihood of damage. So we take that into account as well. First floor height, of course, is important because depending upon how high that floor is off the ground, also will affect the flood likelihood and severity. And last but not least, the construction type. Different construction is subject to different magnitudes of flood damage, and therefore a masonry type of foundation is going to be reacting totally different than a stick-built type of foundation. Last but not least, we're taking into account a much broader range of flood frequencies than that 1% annual chance or 100-year event. Risk rating 2.0 looks at the likelihood of flooding as it may occur in the average year and as it occurs perhaps every 1 or 10,000 years. That range of frequency and everything between is fed into our rating system. And again, there's fees and surcharges built in as well. Another way of understanding the differences here, we'll take a look at our current or legacy system over on the left-hand side. You see two structures that are located in the special flood hazard area. That structure toward the top right is much closer to the flooding source, that blue band, than the structure over on the left-hand side. But because they're both in the same zone, using the legacy system, they achieve the same premium. And just stop and say that the premiums that we'll be looking at here are for discussional purposes only. They do not reflect actual premiums. Over on the right-hand side, you can see, however, that the risk rating system takes a look at, among other things, proximity of the structure to the flooding source. So that structure toward the upper right is going to be more expensive to insure than that structure that is in the lower left, which is much further away from the flooding source. Another way of looking at the differences under the legacy system, again, over on the left-hand side, you can see that there are two structures which are fairly close to that same line of demarcation between the special flood and the non-special flood hazard areas. The structure toward the upper right appears to be just barely within special flood hazard area. Structure toward the lower left appears to be just barely outside that area. But we're looking at a significant difference in premium, and really, if you think about that for a moment, doesn't really make sense, since those structures, because of their proximity to the flooding event, would be roughly the same loss exposure. And over on the right-hand side, as you'll see, those two same structures, because of their different but marginal proximity to the flooding source, premiums that we would be charging for those two structures would be much more similar. Another way of understanding it, we think now that including the replacement cost value of the structure makes risk rating 2.0 a much fairer way to derive rates. And over on the right-hand side, you can see that there's two separate homes depicted, one of them smaller, the other one larger. The smaller one obviously does not have the same replacement cost value as the larger one. But under the legacy system, we would be charging the same exact premium for both of those structures, assuming that they purchase the same amount of coverage. But when it came to loss time, of course, we'd have to pay out probably a lot more for the larger, more expensive structure because of replacement cost value. So under risk rating 2.0, we're taking into account that very important replacement cost value, or RCV, and we would be charging a higher premium for the structure that's larger and newer than the one that's older, probably less expensive, because there would be a significant difference in payout should a flooding event affect both of those structures. So the replacement cost value, again, figured in under the legacy system on the left-hand side. Since replacement costs not factored into the premium, those two structures that we just looked at in picture form would have approximately the same premium, assuming that they bought the same $100,000 level of coverage. But as you can see at the bottom there, the payouts are likely to be significantly different. So on the right-hand side, we'll take that into account, and if both of those structures were insured for the same amount of coverage, premium for the smaller, less expensive structure would be much reduced from that of the larger, more expensive to replace structure. So again, the payout is going to reflect the likelihood of flood severity, flood frequency. If you're not familiar with our legacy system, one of the tools that we used for rating purposes, something called the elevation certificate. And an elevation certificate is a form which provides a certain substantial amount of information that's helpful for purposes of flood insurance rating. The elevation certificate is typically required to be filled out by a surveyor or an architect or an engineer. And of course, that involves an out-of-pocket expense for the property owner who may be required to get an elevation certificate in order to get an accurate rate under the legacy system. Under our risk rating 2.0 system, however, no elevation certificates are required. We are able, using this system, to determine a proper rate based on structure's geolocation, proximity to water, lowest floor height, etc., etc. So the elevation certificate is not a necessity. And again, the reality of our old versus new rating systems. Unfortunately, under the legacy system, people had to scramble in some cases to get an elevation certificate in order to get their policy properly rated and in force, whereas under the risk rating 2.0, of course, that same scramble does not need to occur. We can use all of the information that is provided to us through our own resources and supplemented by few responses necessary from the property owner, and come up with an insurance rate. And I want to stop right here and say that the difference between the two systems in terms of insurance agents providing a quote is night and day. Under the legacy system, quotes were extremely difficult to come by and were not necessarily binding until the actual policy was in force. The risk rating 2.0 system, however, involves a quote system that takes about 15, 20 minutes. So it's much shorter process, much easier on the property owner, much easier on the insurance agent, rather. And that says that everybody who has a property that is at risk for flooding, and again, we think every property is to a degree, has the ability to go to their current insurance agent or company and obtain a free quotation of flood insurance. Again, it's quick, it's painless, it's accurate, and if you are a property owner and you have not done that so far, it's probably for good time for you to revisit that with your insurance agent or company. And again, you don't need to worry about the elevation certificate or any rating ramifications that occur if you don't have one. We, under the legacy system, provided certain instances where mitigation activities would reduce premium, and that is also true under risk rating 2.0. You're looking at a structure which probably represents the ideal for flood damage purposes. You've got a structure that's elevated nicely under on piles or piers or posts, free space underneath it, and if that water in the background comes sloshing in, passes underneath the building, likelihood very little, if any, damage will occur to that structure because of its elevated nature. And so we do provide a premium discount for any structure that is elevated on piles, posts, or piers, and that is true no matter where the structure is located. This type of elevation typically was only taken into account in the special flood hazard areas under the legacy system, but under risk rating 2.0, we will provide that discount no matter where the structure is located. Similar situation involving credits, flood openings rather. Flood openings, or as sometimes they're referred to as proper openings, is a situation where a foundation has openings in it, and the purpose of those openings is to allow the free flow of water inside and outside the building's foundation. And the free flow of water in and out really equalizes the pressure that's inside and outside that foundation wall, and therefore reduces, if not outright eliminates, damage that may occur to the foundation. And again, those were in some cases requirements under the legacy system, and we only took that into account in the special flood hazard areas. Whereas under risk rating 2.0, we provide the incentive for obtaining flood openings or property openings. Will receive a credit, and those credits will be given no matter where the structure is located, both inside and outside of the high risk area. And I think over time, we're going to see a pretty significant difference in floodplain management practices. For the most part, for floodplain management, we've only really concentrated on the special flood hazard areas shown on our maps. But because of these new pricing differences, because of the availability of credits, no matter where a structure is located, I think there's going to be some difference in the type of advice that floodplain managers will be giving property owners in the future. And last but not least, we also provide mitigation credits for the elevation of any machinery and equipment that is servicing the building. Needless to say, the elevation of this type of equipment serves to prevent it from being damaged during a flooding event. And if it is not damaged during a flooding event, number one, we don't have to pay for it under the flood insurance policy. And number two, the property owner would have the ability, the likelihood after a flooding event has happened, to be able to begin recovery with functioning heat, functioning air conditioning, functioning hot water, you name it. It's going to be a whole easier process to recover from flooding with machinery and elevated equipment in place. And again, that credit is given no matter where the structure is located in the community. So there are a number of things that are not changing. People over time, as we'll see shortly, have seen rate increases annually. And a few years back, Congress passed some legislation which provided rate caps on how much we can increase flood insurance premiums on an annual basis. And because those are statutory rate caps, those rate caps will continue to apply under risk rating 2.0. As we've already looked, the availability of premium discounts will continue in our new rating methodology. And one of the things that also continues is what we call assignment of policy, or the transfer of an existing policy from a seller to a buyer. We encourage that transfer because it, number one, provides a no break in coverage. Number two, it can be done simply by submitting a signed endorsement to indicate that there is a new property owner, and any policy discounts that apply to that existing policy will transfer on over to the new homeowner. The use of the flood insurance rate maps, we looked at the example of it earlier on. Those flood insurance rate maps will continue to be provided and updated for each community for their use in floodplain management, and also for the lender uses in determining those structures that are subject to the mandatory purchase requirement. And yes, there are some conditions where people must purchase flood insurance, and those are the conditions where a structure that is serving as collateral for a federally backed or federally regulated loan is determined to be in a special flood hazard area. Under those circumstances, the property owner would have to purchase and maintain flood insurance, and that has been true since the early 70s. Community rating system is a portion of the program that's been around for quite some time, and I see my friend Mary Carson Stiff of Wetlands Watch is on the line with us. Mary has just done a fantastic job for us. Hey, Mary Carson, a fantastic job for us in heading up the users group on the coastal Virginia area. She is just an amazing source of information. And quite honestly, while I'm the CRS coordinator for the region, if you have questions about CRS program, you probably do well to talk to Mary Carson. But long story short, community rating system will continue to be a part of this program. If you're not familiar with it, every community that participates in the program is responsible for certain minimum requirements in terms of floodplain management practices, but there are some communities that go above and beyond those minimum requirements, and because they are at higher standards, they're likely to experience fewer flooding events, less damage during a flooding event, and so we reward those communities through the application of premium discounts for structures in the community. And under the legacy system, those premium discounts only applied to those structures, or for the most part applied to those structures located in the special flood hazard areas. In some cases, they were lower percentages of discounts for structures that were outside of the special flood hazard area. Under the risk rating 2.0, however, we will extend those premium discounts for structures no matter where they are located in the community. And that's a significant advance, I think, in the program, and well deserved, because as we say, flooding can and does happen anywhere, so why should we not reward communities and property owners for taking active measures to reduce flooding damage or severity? When and how? We've already begun the process. Our new business policies, effective on or after October 1st, 2021, have been rated using risk rating 2.0 methodology. So we are 3+ months into the process. Things seem to be going pretty well. And the existing renewal policies that we have in force, as policies come up for renewal effective on or after April 1st of this year, those policies will be rated using both systems, the legacy system and risk rating 2.0. And for those policyholders, for that renewal period, we will provide them with a lower rate that comes out of either legacy or risk rating 2.0. The scenario here, typically at instances where a property is changing hands, typically at the closing table is, unfortunately, in certain circumstances, when the buyer of that property first hears about having to purchase flood insurance under mandatory purchase, and they are then forced to scramble to get a policy enforced. Typically, it's under what we call provisional rating, which means we have no way to determine what the rate should be. So we charge extremely high rates until we get the rating information that we need to properly rate that policy. Under risk rating 2.0, however, that won't happen anymore. We'll have all of the information we need to rate that property. And again, elevation certificates will no longer be required. One of the ongoing challenges of the program is affordability. As the program has evolved over time, there's been differences of opinion in terms of whether or not this program should actually have to pay for itself. In the early days, flood insurance policies were afforded at a very, very low level of premium. And over time, those premiums had tended to rise. And in some cases, now and in the past, the premium has been a challenge to pay for certain of property owners, certain of our customers as well. So we are doing what we can to address affordability. A few years back, FEMA published an affordability framework. It's online available. It's a fascinating document if you've never read it, but it's really all about if a affordability program is instituted, how can it be administered? And there's a number of ways to do that. It can be administered at the community level, the state level. It can be administered through premium reductions. It can be administered through grants for mitigation activities. Who is eligible for the affordability program can also be measured in a number of different ways. And again, all of that information is part of the affordability framework we've published. We are continuing to work with our partners in Congress to address affordability issues, and there have been some interesting proposals on how that may take place the next time the National Flood Insurance Program is reauthorized by Congress. Let's take a look specifically at how this program is playing out in Virginia. I want you to take a moment to look at this. This is a representation of the national policy base. Prior to instituting risk rating 2.0, we thought it would be a good idea to see what the net effects would be of the rating methodology change, legacy system versus risk rating 2.0. And we found out very interestingly that about 1 in 4 of our policyholders, 23%, will see lower premiums under risk rating 2.0 than they will under the legacy system. And keep in mind, you see the information in the gray bar near the top of the page. Under the legacy system, no one ever saw a premium decrease unless we were misrating them. Premiums under the legacy system tended to rise each year at renewal. Average premium increase of about $8 per month annually. And as you can compare that then to the risk rating 2.0 results, whereas again, in some cases, premiums will be reduced. In other cases, or about 66% of the cases in Virginia, those policies will either see no increase or a per month increase anywhere between $1 and $10 But again, compare that to the $8 per month under the legacy. Most of the people in those categories are making out better, or not making out too badly, as it were. Over on the right-hand side, you can see that there are a certain percentage of premium policies that will see higher levels of premium, but we will not be increasing those premiums immediately on renewal because of the premium caps and because of our efforts to maintain affordability. Premiums under risk rating 2.0 will tend to increase gradually when they need to be increased at all. The target here is to achieve something called the full risk rate. And full risk rate is pretty much exactly what you would think. If we have an existing structure in a certain location, how much premium should we be charging for that to adequately cover the structure and make sure that we've got all of our premium bases covered? And that full risk rate will be provided to each and every one of our policyholders. And again, in some cases, the full risk rate will be lower than they're paying right now, so they'll see a premium reduction. A full risk rate may be about the same or higher, but people will know ultimately what the actual premium should be for their structure and pretty much where their premiums will be heading in the future. So that takes care of the analysis for Virginia, and I'll show you where you can find that information in just a bit. But taking a look at the national average versus all of our FEMA Region 3 states listed there, you can see that Virginia is highlighted. Long story short, Virginia will actually be seeing a pretty fair amount of policies experiencing premium reductions. Again, most of those will be for the owners of pre-firm structures, and so about 1 out of every 2 policyholders in Virginia should see a rate decrease. Great majority of the rest of them will see a modest rate increase, if at all. This slide, I refer to it as the camouflage slide, but the idea here is to show differences through color ranges of the number of policies that are in force in any given area, and how many of those policies are likely to see rate increases or rate increases. So you can take additional time after our session is done today if you want to fully digest and understand the information that's contained on this slide. We're coming up now with the second step of phased risk rating 2.0, existing renewal policies effective 1st April or afterwards are coming up, and we need to take into account that any renewal policy needs to get a notice of renewal at least 45 days before the policy renewal date. So if your policy is renewing April 1st, you're going to be seeing a renewal notice at the middle of this month. So we need to kind of calculate what the major activity will be. As you can see, Virginia highlighted in red font there, the majority of Virginia policies in force renew between May and August, similar to other states as well, and that really reflects the fact that most property owners tend to purchase their policies during hurricane season. And again, the summer months are, of course, the most active for hurricane as well as the most active for our policy activities. How can you help your property owners, yourself, your constituents? Again, the best advice I can give anybody is to go to your insurance agent or company and get a quote on flood insurance. There's a lot of folks out there who think that premiums will be too expensive for them, or et cetera, et cetera. This takes the guesswork out of it. With just a little time invested, any property owner can find out the bottom line for flood insurance protection. And again, looking at flooding events increasing in frequency and severity over the recent past, and projected to do the same in the future, flood insurance coverage, I think, becomes more and more important as time goes by. The home is probably most people's largest investment, and protection of that investment is one of the products of flood insurance policy, of course. And again, visit with your current insurance agent or company. They know you and the options that are available to you better than anybody else. And because of the new system that we're using, it's much easier for them to deal with with the National Flood Insurance Program. Our product was kind of confusing in the past, and we're certainly taking steps to streamline and simplify it. And also in those areas where mitigation activities may be beneficial, and that's just about anywhere. One of the good things that's happening is that we're providing more and more funding availability for mitigation activities through the BRIC program, through HMGP, and that, I believe, will continue to increase over time. There was a study done not all that long ago which indicated that for every dollar spent on mitigation activities, there is a savings of about $5 or $6 damage avoided. So the more we can get out in front of the events, the better off all of us are. And we've already talked about the community rating system. I just want to add a few things. Again, it's a voluntary program. In Virginia, there are currently 28 communities that are participating, not all of them in coastal areas, as you can see, looking at Ashland, Bridgewater, Richmond, et cetera, and as time has gone by and as premiums have tended to increase, more and more communities have expressed interest in participating in the community rating system. Again, there's plenty of information that's available for you, and those links toward the bottom of the slide will give you a real good overview of the community rating system. For Risk Rating 2.0, generally, we do have a website which provides an incredible amount of information. Website address is up in the gray bar toward the top of the screen there. Some of the information that you will provide are fact sheets related to this program and how it affects the different states. There's a video that really does a good job of explaining what we are going over today. The national rate analysis that we've already looked at, the state profiles we've already looked at, are then broken down into categories of zip code level data and to county level data. So there's a lot of useful information out there depending upon how it's sliced and diced. And over on the right-hand side, and this is where it really gets pretty concentrated, the Risk Rating 2.0 system is based on work that was done over five and a half years. And there is a full explanation of how the system was developed, how it functions, et cetera, and if you want to look at those pieces of information, that's where you can really get into the weeds. So before we go to question and answer, just want to let you know that my contact information up at the top. Down at the bottom is contact information for Maggie Dunn. Some of you may know Maggie. She's our regional outreach specialist and serves as my partner in terms of outreach and also in terms of delivering these presentations.
Alrighty, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Wendy Howard Cooper for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund.
All right, thank you guys for joining us for this afternoon session. As Angela said, we are getting ready to talk about the meat of this, the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, and how we can help you meet the objectives of your community through application to this fund. Next slide, please. So the program was established in 2020 through legislation, and it is to provide support to regions and localities to address and reduce the impacts of flooding throughout their communities. And you know, this is something that we know is going to continue, and developing a strategy long-term to mitigate the effects of flooding is really the goal of this program, but it is also to make sure that we're operating in an equitable manner. One of the components of this program is that no less than 25% of the monies dispersed from this program actually go to low-income geographic communities. We take that charge very seriously and are working to make sure that we are prioritizing those communities. Next slide, please. So the Community Flood Preparedness Fund is funded through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There are 11 states that currently participate in RGGI, including Virginia, and the goal is to collectively reduce carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. The auction of carbon credits is what produces the income for this fund. Next slide, please. The legislation set up the way the fund is split between different agencies. DCR receives 45% of this fund to do the work that we are doing under the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. The Department of Housing receives 50%, and I'm sorry, having some trouble this morning speaking. I apologize for that. DEQ receives a portion for administrative cost, and Department of Energy, which was DMME, Mines and Mineral, also receives a portion of the fund. But what we're talking about today is the 45% that DCR receives to run the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. Next slide, please. So how do we use RGGI funds? It is to provide grants and in the future loans to localities and communities. We have funded the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. I'm sure most of you heard the governor's announcement about that plan in early December. There are still refinements that have to happen to the plan. So some funding from the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, and I will now refer to it as CFPF, will be used for that purpose, as well as to update the flood protection plan for the entirety of the state. There has been some misconception that the CFPF was purely for coastal communities, and I think that is because it does support the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, but the CFPF supports the entirety of the Commonwealth, and we want to make sure that folks understand that and realize that they have access to that. And today we want to show you how this fund can benefit your community. The CFPF also supports staff-related activities at the department. Next slide, please. So how much money has actually flowed into this fund? We got our first auction proceeds in March of 2021. The total auction for Virginia was $43.5 million, and DCR received $19.5 million. In June, the auction was 45.4. DCR received 20.4 million. September, it was 52.9 million and DCR received 23.7. And in December, it was 85.6 million, of which DCR received 38.4 million to use in the CFPF. Next slide, please. So the grant manual has been published. We have three grant rounds under our belt now. One is active, but the grant manual has pretty much stayed the same these first three grant rounds because we have tried to very quickly get funding out to the communities because the money was there and we wanted to make sure that folks had access to it. The grant manual hasn't changed beyond the dates and the dollars. And the third manual, we made an update to reflect the Coastal Resilience Master Plan publication. But each of the manuals has this information in it. Part one really talks about the planning principles and provides the definitions that we use in this program. Next slide, please. Part two talks about the eligibility criteria and the application procedures. How do we make these grants available to folks, what our limitations are, what our process is. And that's really important because there is some, I guess there's some gray areas that people aren't quite sure how this whole process works, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Part three talks about the eligible activities, and this is really where the rubber meets the road. What can you use the fund for? There are three eligible categories: capacity building and planning, flood prevention and protection projects, and studies. And later in this presentation, the team will go through each of those and help you understand what that means exactly and how that can help your community. Next slide, please. Part four of the manual basically just gives you what your required components are. Regardless of which category you apply under, every application has to have a scope of work, a detailed scope of work narrative that allows us to understand what you are planning to do, what your timelines are, what your accomplishments are expected to be, all of those things that you would expect in a grant application. The budget narrative is another component that is critically important. We just don't need a budget. We need a detailed narrative to help us understand who's going to be doing the work. Who are we paying? If you have travel, where are you traveling? Who is traveling? How many people are traveling? If you're paying a contractor, do they have a timeline? Do they have milestones? And is it broken out by phases so we know how much is reasonable in each phase? So all of that is critically important when you are crafting your budget and your budget narrative. Next slide, please. Resilience plans, I refer to this as the gateway to projects in the CFPF. In order to have access to project funding, your community has to have a resilience plan. It needs to be project-based and really focuses on flood control and resilience. It has to incorporate nature-based solutions to the greatest extent possible. We know that there are situations where that is not always going to be the answer, but we are prioritizing nature-based solutions. It has to include all parts of the community, all parts of the community. I say that again. You have to look at, regardless of socioeconomics or race, every area of your community so that we are crafting a whole community approach to resilience. Has to include coordination. If you are doing a regional project or even just within your community, there are agencies or departments within your community that all need to be brought to the table. You want to talk to your NGOs, you want to talk to your faith-based organizations. You really want this to be a comprehensive strategy to address the flooding needs in your community. And it needs to use the best available science. We know that climate change is real, and we want to ensure that we are making forward-thinking decisions when we are developing these resilience plans. Next slide, please. So in the Commonwealth thus far, we have received 9 resilience plans that have been approved. We have 1 plan that has been denied, and we have provided feedback to that community so that they can correct the resilience plan and have access to project funding. Next slide, please. The schedule for CFPF, you all are probably aware, round 2 closed on November 5th, and we announced those awards just a couple of weeks ago, $24.5 million. On January 5th, we opened the 3rd application period, and that round will close on April 8th, and we expect those awards to be announced mid-June. Next slide, please. So just to go over what we have done thus far, round 1 closed September 4th. We received 32 applications requesting just over $16 million, and we awarded $7.8 million. There were several applications that could be amended in round 1 that we asked to have resubmitted with the round 2 applications, and we did receive those. And we were able to fund 1 additional of those applications with round 2. Round 2 applications closed November 5th. We received 37 applications requesting more than $28 million, and we were able to fund 30 projects at the amount of $24.5 million. We had not put out that much money for round 2, but we did use unobligated funds from round 1 to allow us to make the awards for round 2. Round 3 again opened on January 5th, closes April 8th, and there is $40 million available in this application period. Next slide, please. Again, there were 69 applications between round 1 and round 2. 25 of those applications were for planning and capacity building. 29 of those applications were for projects with pre-approved resilience plans, and 15 were for studies. Next slide. In the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, there are PDCs that are identified as coastal. And so this slide really talks about those coastal localities that are identified in the PDC, in the Coastal Resilience Master Plan versus the rest of the state. Out of the 69 applications, 60 of the applications came from those coastal localities. 9 came from inland localities. Next slide, please. Applications from cities and counties totaled 44. We received 5 applications from towns, 19 from planning district commissions, and 1 from a organization we consider other, which was the Hampton Roads Service District. Next slide, please. We often receive a question about rural versus urban. Are we providing support to urban communities? Is this just going to be a urban program? Are rural communities going to get left behind? Based on what we have seen in the application pool, we received 20 applications from rural areas and funded 12 of those, or 60%. We received 49 applications from urban areas and funded 37, or 75%. Next slide, please. The application review process is a multi-step process. The applications are received, logged, and provided an initial review to see if things are obviously glaring, like a signature is missing, or something that should have been there is missing. So we would let the grantee know, the applicant know, to correct that as soon as possible. and also what the project is for. We look at the descriptions and try to get a feel for what the initial project is. And that's important because we provide a preliminary list of the applications as well as the descriptions of those projects to agency leadership, as well as the Chief Resilience Officer and the Special Assistant to the Governor for Coastal Adaptation and Protection. Next slide, please. Then the applications are reviewed by the team at DCR, the floodplain team at DCR, using the criteria that is set out in the grant manual and evaluating each of the projects on their own merit and where they fit in the whole community resilience process, which is really the goal of the CFPF. Those recommendations are provided to me as the division director, and I perform a secondary review and provide any comments out and make my recommendations to agency leadership. And we have a discussion, we go over the applications, and if any corrections are needed, we make those at that time. Next slide, please. And then those recommendations are provided to the Chief Resilience Officer and the Special Assistant to the Governor. And we have a discussion about each of the grants, what they're for, what the recommendations are, if there are reductions, why those reductions are there, if there are denials, why projects are denied, and those final recommendations are approved, and those discussions are had with the governor's office. And I have this may not be the case here because we know that the governor announces all of the awards, but I'm not sure that in each award period of the coordination that happens with the governor's office in this final recommendation piece. So just wanted to put that caveat there. But the awards are announced, and they have been announced by the governor each time. Next slide, please. Reporting and compliance is also a very important component of this project. And while these are locally administered activities and projects, DCR does have a role in here, but grantees do have to adhere to the normal process when projects are happening within their communities. And if it's in a floodplain, of course, you have to follow the NFIP and the ordinance that's in your community. You have to follow your permitting processes for wetlands and other activities that happen on a regular basis in your community. So this does not remove that requirement for any of those processes. So just want to make sure that folks are clear on that. Next slide, please. What DCR will do is, where applicable, we will conduct site visits and inspections to monitor the projects for compliance. Grantees have to submit quarterly progress reports detailing their progress toward the milestones that they have put in their grant application. And if there are delays, why there are delays. So those types of reports will have to come to DCR quarterly. Next slide, please. We will not reimburse projects if we don't have those progress reports. It's really important for folks to understand that we have to have those reports for the accountability for this program. It is, you all know, it's very high profile, but just in general, for any grant program, this is a normal part of the process. There's a level of accountability that has to occur, and it is not different for CFPF. And no final reimbursements will be made from this program unless we have received the deliverables. And if that is, final drawings, the record report for construction project, whatever it may be, we have to have those final deliverables before we can release the final payment. Next slide, please. There are a number of improvements that we need to make to the grant manual for CFPF. There are clarifications that need to happen to definitions. There may be more things that we need to put in the manual, more categories that could be funded to make sure that people are really getting the best benefit from this program. We need to develop loan guidelines if that's appropriate for the CFPF and funding continues. So there are things that we hope to improve in the next grant round. We just haven't had the opportunity because this is considered guidance. We have to do a 30-day public comment period, and at the pace that we have been moving on this program, we've just not been afforded that time. We are hopeful to have that done before round 4 is released. Next slide, please. Alrighty, eligible categories. I will turn this back over to the team. Are there any questions, though, before we move into this next part? All right, thank you, Angela.
Before we move on, I do see, Wendy, that we do have a question in the chat. Is low income defined as part of the community or the entire locality?
That is a good question. And the answer is yes to both, because you could do a project that affects the entire community, and you would need to use the median income for the entire community. Or you could do a project within a specific neighborhood within your community, and the median income for that particular zip code would be what you would measure against to determine the median income.
Great question. Now we are going to move to the eligible categories section of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. The Community Flood Preparedness Fund has 3 categories of funding, and the first one we're going to discuss is the capacity category. The purpose of the capacity category is used to establish the necessary foundation for developing and implementing comprehensive approaches to flood preparedness and resilience. You can think of this as a means for the community to better position themselves for resilience and resources. Applicants should think about, what does the community need and want to build its capabilities to prepare for and combat flooding? This may be accomplished by utilizing services, personnel, and contractors, planning for the community programs or projects, in addition to the development of a standalone resilience plan. So on the screen, you'll see a couple of examples of ways to build capacity within the community. And I'm just going to pose a couple of questions to get you all thinking about what kind of ways may be applicable to your community. Does the community have an inventory of community infrastructure and assets, such as buildings, roads, and bridges? And have you compared them to the relation of the identified flood zone? Does your community have an administrative procedure in place to carry out the substantial damage estimates? And if you do have a substantial damage procedure in place, does it include debris management? Is there a plan in place to remove debris after a disaster? On the road to recovery, this is often an issue between responsible parties. Does the community remove debris or individual property owners? Software and hardware. Does your community have the software needed to access data and resources? The same question can be posed for hardware. Maybe the community needs tools and supplies to carry out flood prevention, protection, and recovery activities. Database management. Does the community have a program in place and the ability to manage parcel data, flood risk data, which would include regulatory and non-regulatory data, high water marks, flood insurance data, or any other kind of information you want to manage? Contractor services. may be necessary in order to carry out capacity building within the community. This can be done by obtaining the services of private firms, universities, nonprofit organizations, or other entities. Has the community thought about education outreach? This can be executed through the development of flood risk communication materials, outreach for risk map studies. Maybe your community is getting a new flood map from FEMA and you'd like to hold an open house event to review with the general public. Capacity building can be done for that and be utilized for that. Flood zone change notifications, which are required by state code, may be funded through the capacity application as well. Your community might also want to think about embarking on a Flood Awareness Week campaign or any kind of Risk Rating 2.0 flood insurance engagements. Because this is a statewide fund, NFIP participation is not required. However, the funds may be used for communities currently not participating to conduct activities needed to enter in the program, or for currently participating communities who maybe want to enter in the CRS program. The fund may also be used to upgrade existing plans and integrate them into forward-thinking strategies. Applicants will need to identify the capacity needs and assets of the area that is being applied for. Resource needs identification. What does the locality need in terms of financial, human resources, technical assistance, and training? Does the community have a plan for building the knowledge, skills, and ability of the current staff or hiring new staff? And please remember, this fund cannot supplant salaries of existing staff. A resource development strategy. How is the locality going to fill the gaps and increase capacity for funding? Policy management or development. What policies, codes, guidelines, or best practices do you currently operate with or without that may need to be updated within your community? Do some of the proposed activities require policy changes? And the other items, goals and objectives, stakeholder identification, those are pretty straightforward. But in stakeholder identification, we'd like you to start thinking about who is being impacted by the activities proposed. How are they aware of what's happening around them? And is this being done equitably? Is there a plan to implement? And is there a schedule in place as well? Parties, performance measures, and plans for maintaining the capacity should all be included in your application as well. The next eligible category is for studies. A study application can be for qualitative or quantitative studies to inform and improve planning solutions for flood risk reduction. On the screen, you'll see a couple of examples of different ways studies can be utilized by the community. Studies can be utilized for floodplain ordinance revisions. If your community wants to do an H&H study for a flood insurance rate map update, or if you want to identify local flood risk areas that are not mapped on the flood insurance rate maps, as well as updating precipitation data and sea level rise projections. We have several more examples of different studies and ways that studies can be used, and I'm not going to read all of them to you, but one that I did want to point out is on the bottom left-hand side, alluvial fans, mudslides, and other flood risks. We have recognized that there is an increased need for localities to take this information into account to truly understand their comprehensive flood risk, and there is limited information about this available out there. So if your community does have a need to get a study out there to analyze this information, please apply for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. A studies application will include the specific type of study, and if it's an improvement to one that is already existing, or a brand new study. The application should also include how the study assists flood prevention and protection needs of the community, the qualifications of the individuals involved, as well as the goals, and if applicable, how the study improves resilience statewide. The last category is for projects. Projects assist communities move the needle beyond planning and into actionable projects. Project applications require resilience plans that are approved by DCR in order to be eligible for this funding category. If the community does not have the necessary foundation for projects, capacity and studies would be an excellent starting point. After the foundation has been established, well thought out projects which increase resilience to flooding to the community can be applied for here. There's also a requirement for a certified floodplain manager within the community to approve the projects that are being applied for. The project application includes a lot of the elements that were required for the studies or capacity application, but it also includes a deeper dive into the community information as far as the population, demographics, the history of flooding within the community, flood frequency, as well as the local government's ability to provide its share of the cost. So all of those are required for project applications. If a project is being applied for by an entity that is not a locality, that means they're a local government that's been established by the General Assembly, like a planning district commission or soil and water conservation district, they can apply for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund as well, as long as they have letters of support from the affected local governments and can provide evidence of the ability to provide the required match funds and the positive impacts of the project or study on the prevention of flooding have been demonstrated in the application. Their projects may be eligible for funding as well. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Brandy, who is going to discuss in-depthly how to get a resilience plan developed.
If I can figure out how to get unmuted, right? Hi, everybody, and thank you, Angela. I appreciate it. So I'm going to be presenting on the Resilience Plan Roadmap today. This is based on a document that has been in development to provide more detail on the Resilience Plan, the requirements for the Resilience Plan, and just some helpful information and examples that we put together for generating the Resilience Plan. So there are still just a couple of updates that I need to make to it, but after today's meeting, once that's finalized, we're going to be sending this document along with the additional materials that we've discussed previously to all the meeting attendees via email. So I'm just going to start off briefly with some general information about the Resilience Plan, and then I'm going to segue into some helpful tips on drafting and submission of the Resilience Plan for your locality. So the Resilience Plan, as per the definition outlined within the Community Flood Preparedness Fund Grant Manual, refers to a locally adopted plan that describes the entire local government's approach to flooding and meets the following criteria. So number one, the plan must be project-based, and these projects must be focused on flood control and resilience. I just want to also mention here that this plan should also identify and include the various types of flooding that are occurring and all the different flood zones within the community, and also include the number of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties. Criteria 2, the plan must incorporate nature-based infrastructure to the maximum extent possible. Criteria number 3, The plan must include considerations of all parts of a local government, regardless of socioeconomics or race. I just want to also note here that the resilience plan should be equity focused and should be prioritizing vulnerable populations subjected to flooding, not just populations that are vulnerable to flooding. Criteria number 4, there must be coordination with other local and interjurisdictional projects, plans, and activities. And the plan must have a clearly articulated timeline or phasing plan for implementation. And then finally, number 5, it must be based on the best available science and incorporate climate change, sea level rise, storm surge data where appropriate, and it also must utilize the current floodplain maps. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between submitting a standalone plan versus a compilation plan. So resilience plans may refer to a previously adopted standalone plan, or it can be a compilation of documents with excerpts from those plans that when compiled together address the elements of the definition found in the grant manual. Sources of elements of compiled documents may include sections from regional or local plans, such as local comprehensive plans, land use plans, ordinances, etc. It can include sections from local or regional hazard mitigation plans, excerpts from a plan developed that addresses flooding and resilience. It might include other elements and plans that are developed for a local government by a third party that address any of those elements in the 5 criteria. And it might also include regional strategies or plans in which the local government is just a party of. So I just want to talk about some examples of plans and things from those plans that can be used. So for example, you might take components from a standard comprehensive plan. You can gather maybe some information regarding economic and social conditions, for example, and then this information can then be utilized for identifying vulnerable populations and helping you to address criteria 3. Strategic plans usually are identifying specific needs and plans to address those. These can cover a wide range of topics, such as wetland restoration, infrastructure, land use planning, but this can be helpful in developing targeted projects as well as incorporating nature-based solutions. You have hazard mitigation plans that identify associated hazards and mitigation strategies to address these. They might contain critical infrastructure located within the community. It might contain community profiles. But this information can be utilized to ensure that all the hazards within the community have been evaluated and plans are being implemented to address those hazards. It might be a valuable resource in meeting potentially multiple criteria within that resilience plan, just depending on the level of detail for that specific hazard mitigation plan. You can use stormwater and drainage plans. They often identify flooding issues, outline specific projects that are being designed to mitigate those issues. And I also want to mention Appendix G in the grant manual as well, because that's going to contain a list of examples of additional plan elements that could be used in the resilience plan submission as well. In either case, a standalone plan or the document that includes compiled elements of multiple plans, either one of those are acceptable for submission. However, a compilation of plans is going to require the identification of the sources of the plans or elements that are being submitted. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this in the following slides. So now that we have a little bit better understanding on what the components of the resilience plan are, now I just want to talk about developing a resilience plan that's going to adequately address each one of those components. So the very first step that the community should be taking is to first and foremost evaluate your resources, capabilities, and your needs. The applicant on behalf of the community needs to ask, are you able to submit a standalone plan? How robust do you want it to be? Do we as a community have access to a compilation of documents to meet the elements described in the grant manual? Do you have the resources or staff necessary to gather and organize this information into a format that's going to meet the requirements as they are presented in the grant manual? So If you don't have the resources or even the existing plans that are necessary to compile a resilience plan submission, another thing that you might want to consider is applying for a capacity building grant to hire a contractor to fulfill this request for your community. This would provide the community with the means necessary to hire someone specifically to do a thorough and robust evaluation of the needs of the entire community and develop a resilience plan. So this could be really ideal for smaller communities whose floodplain administrators are wearing multiple hats and they're trying to prioritize too many different projects. They might not have the ability to research and obtain all of the required information and create that resiliency plan on their own. Excuse me, hold on just one second. If you do not have the resources necessary to compile a standalone document, but you have access to other local and regional plans that are going to be containing the information necessary, it might be possible to use excerpts of these existing plans to fulfill the requirements as outlined in the previous slides. If the community chooses to go this route and utilize components from other existing plans, they will be required to submit an outline or a cover page that's going to be identifying all the components or the language being utilized and how those are applicable. Also, it needs to include the locations for those excerpts and from which of the plans they're going to be taken from to meet the requirements as laid out in the grant manual. I've taken some examples from some submitted resiliency plans for 3 separate localities to show some different ideas on how this has been done previously. So in this first example, you can see that the locality has developed a spreadsheet. It outlines on the left-hand side each of the individual components of the resiliency plan that they're trying to meet. And then along the top, it lists out each of the plans that they're utilizing to find those excerpts to meet the criteria. And then underneath in each of those boxes just shows the location where that criteria is being met. And I just want to mention each one of these if in case you can't see, it's not detailed enough, what these individual plans are. And yes, Mary, this is going to be, we're going to be providing the slides, and I'm also going to be providing the document that this is based off of that's going to include all of these examples. But I just want to list off some of these plans just for communities to get a better idea for where some of these examples are being taken from. So they used their comprehensive plan, their regional hazard mitigation plan, an emergency operations plan, floodplain management ordinance, their zoning ordinance, their subdivision ordinance, capital improvement, dam safety program, and their watershed program. So they used bits and pieces from all of those different plans and programs to be able to find all the components necessary to meet the requirements within the resilience plan. So in this next example, you can see this is a similar setup with a spreadsheet that contains all of the relevant information. But this example is just a little bit more detailed in what it contains. For example, it has where in the grant manual that particular criteria is found, whether or not it's going to be those 5 main criteria or additional things that are listed out in Appendix G. And then it talks about the requirement that's being met. It tells the location and the document from where that excerpt is being taken from. And then finally, they identify the specific language that the community is utilizing to meet that requirement. This makes it a lot easier from a reviewer standpoint to have this reference for finding the specific excerpts that are being referred to. Because some of these plans can be hundreds of pages long, and it can be really difficult to, if they just say, yeah, I took this from the hazard mitigation plan, but you don't know where, and that document is hundreds of pages long, it might be really difficult for the reviewer to actually find what it is that they're referring to and how it's going to be meeting that criteria. So this final example for this is just showing a submission in an outline format. So here it's outlining each of those 5 main criteria, and then it specifies the location for the information that they're utilizing to fulfill this requirement. So this submission is not as detailed as the previous two examples, but if the plans and documents that are being utilized to fulfill the criteria are not really lengthy or complex, this basic outline format is really sufficient for meeting those needs, as long as we can find where it is that this is referring to and what criteria this is meeting, you know, that should be sufficient. Okay, so now I'm just going to break out each of these individual criteria and show some examples from previously submitted resilience plans on how they might have fulfilled these requirements or some different things that they were able to pull from. So the first criteria is that it must be project-based with projects focused on flood control and resilience. The plan should identify and include the various types of flooding occurring in all flood zones and include the number of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties. Consideration should be given to all watersheds within the community, with projects encompassing each of these watersheds. The community should consider an analysis of community social and environmental characteristics. And flood resilience strategy should be tailored to the community with discrete projects identified. So this example is just showing a map that was developed by a locality that submitted their resilience plan. And this map delineates the special flood hazard areas in their community, the locally mapped floodplains, and then the areas that are experiencing recurrent flooding and repetitive losses. So this map is really helpful to allow the locality to visualize the specific areas of concern within their community so that they can prioritize projects appropriately based on their specific community needs. So this next submission from a different locality, it contains a map of showing each individual watershed. So it has different colors representing each one of those. And then what was really unique about this one is that in addition to breaking out those watersheds, it lists those out and actually outlines the specific flooding issues that are being experienced within each one of those individual watersheds. So then they continued to build on this. So now what I have in this next slide is showing from that same community that showed the map breaking out the individual watersheds. This is all of their flood control projects that are being proposed, showing how they're addressing each of the unique issues found within each of those individual watersheds. So it's really neat to see how they've met this requirement by taking that community-wide approach with their resilience plan to ensure that they're focusing on more than just one watershed or one specific type of project or one specific type of flooding within their community. Because the goal for this resilience plan is to acknowledge and develop a plan of action for all of the unique flooding issues that are present within the community. So criteria 2, flood mitigation projects throughout the locality should incorporate nature-based solutions, and these should be identified for the maximum use possible within each specific watershed. So obviously, some types of projects are going to be better suited to incorporate green infrastructure, and we understand that there are some projects where this is not really a viable option. But when developing a resilience plan, you need to be trying to assess the needs for the entire community, but also making sure this criteria helps make sure that the community is also considering and incorporating nature-based options to the maximum extent possible for any project that this can be incorporated on. So the first example that I have is a link that I'm not going to open up. Feel free to visit at your own leisure. Like I said, the slides are going to be provided. This is also going to be in the document that's been drafted up, the resilience plan roadmap. This is a 99-page document, but I just wanted to show an extensive example in which a community has incorporated green infrastructure to the maximum extent possible. They have two main themes of this plan. They are for land and for water. For land, the focus is to protect, connect, and regreen the landscape to provide pathways for people and wildlife, treat stormwater and reduce flooding, and to beautify the city. And then for water, the focus is to restore shoreline habitats to support aquatic life, buffer areas from storm surge, and foster recreation, including birding, boating, and fishing. So the community in this document has emphasized the importance in evaluating a green infrastructure plan just as it would evaluate its great infrastructure plan, because they're both equally important as parts of the city's overall infrastructure plans. So again, feel free to check this out if and when you have the time. And it might spark some ideas of different things that you might not have considered as green infrastructure options that can be incorporated on different projects. So these next two slides show examples from a submission that incorporates nature-based solutions. The first slide seen here is showing different types and descriptions for nature-based solutions along a coastline. Understanding the different options that are available and the pros and cons for each one of these options ahead of time before even developing these projects is going to make it a lot easier for the community to incorporate the most beneficial solution for each project. So this second slide here, again, it's from the same community as the previous slide, and this goes on to talk about hybrid approaches for shoreline protection. And I also just want to add in another connection here that when a community applies down the road for a project through the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, the match requirement is going to be tiered based on the incorporation of nature-based solutions. So taking this into consideration during earlier planning stages, such as developing that resilience plan, can enable the community to benefit from a reduced match requirement for project applications later on down the road. So the third criteria for resilience plan is to include considerations of all parts of a local government, regardless of socioeconomics or race. All parts of a locality need to be considered. So making sure that you're including and addressing all of the watersheds and the entirety of the jurisdictional boundary. Your resilience plan also needs to be equity focused. We're looking at prioritizing vulnerable populations that are subjected to flooding, not just populations that are vulnerable to flooding. A demographic analysis should be conducted and included with your plan. Also, a social vulnerability analysis should be done and documented to address the social implications for flooding hazards and as well as an analysis of at-risk populations. There's no way to really ensure that vulnerable populations are being considered or prioritized without actually looking at the demographics and socioeconomics of the community. So I just wanted to highlight there is a tool that's available to assess social vulnerability utilizing the Virginia Social Vulnerability Index score. This is done at a census tract level. This tool was created by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, or VIMS, and can be found at the link that is present on this slideshow. I'm not going to open it up and go through, but it's a fairly simple tool to navigate. It's really just a map. You activate layers, so you just want to make sure that you're activating the social vulnerability and then activating that social vulnerability index score, and that will allow you to see the score for each individual census tract. But if for some reason you're having any issues or you have any questions on how to use it or navigate it, my contact information is going to be present at the very end of this presentation. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer questions, walk you through a tutorial of how to use it. And as an extra pointer, if you are applying for funding on behalf of an entire community, you will need to add up all of the scores for each census tract and take the average to determine the social vulnerability index score for the entire community. But if the application is only focused on a small subset of the community population, maybe impacting 1 or 2 census tracts, for example, that is going to be your reference point for the social vulnerability index score, not the overall community index score. So something that is not on this slide because the link is really massively long, but it's going to be included in the handout, is an example of a demographic and population vulnerability analysis that a community hired a contractor to complete for them. And it just gives a really good, thorough, detailed view of how this is done and all the different things to be taken into consideration. So of course, feel free to check out any of the reference documents that are going to be provided to you after today's presentation. So these next 3 slides show an example of a scoring matrix that was actually developed by one of our applicants. They partnered with a university to create this flood risk score system that is specific and unique to their community. And this is used to determine the vulnerability and allows that community to prioritize projects based on what they determine to be the most urgent need for their community. So this flood risk score sheet was modeled from an existing flood risk assessment tool that's utilized by North Carolina. The scoring system takes into account different flood risk factors, such as if a property, structure, or driveway would be impacted by floodwater, and then uses that to establish an overall impact-based score. They then add multipliers to this score based on either location-based hazards and the social vulnerability index score. That social vulnerability is based on the Virginia Social Vulnerability Index score created by VIMS that I just talked about in the previous slide. And then at the end, the property receives a flood risk score, which corresponds to a flood risk level that the community has determined the values for. And then this is used internally by that community to go ahead and prioritize projects based on their relative flood risk. This is just, this next slide just shows an example of how they've applied that score. So as you can see, there's a little picture in the lower left-hand corner that shows a structure, and it's in yellow, and that yellow is indicating that it's in an AE zone. And then that, according to the scoring sheet, it's also located in a repetitive loss area, and it is considered to be high social vulnerability. So the resulting flood risk score, after they've calculated everything, is determined to be very high for this priority. So the community can use that and know that, hey, this is something that we need to prioritize because this is very high flood risk. So they might need to address that project maybe before some other projects. So this last example just shows a map that was developed by that same community, and they've looked at the flood risk, and then they've also incorporated the social vulnerability and generated this map that just allows them another way to visualize the priority needs within the community and assure that all of those areas are being considered when looking to build community-wide resilience. So criteria number 4 requires that the resilience plan includes coordination with other projects, plans, and activities. The resilience plan should contain the planning processes and frameworks which outline local and regional plans used by the locality to address resilience and how these have been integrated for flood adaptation planning. The locality should be checking with all other local and interjurisdictional agencies to ensure cooperation amongst all agencies and maintain cohesiveness amongst overlapping plans. When thinking of capacity building and resilience plan development, you also need to consider clarity and consistency within local policies and procedures. For example, it might be beneficial to update existing ordinances to reflect changes in policy or adopt higher standards. The community might need to develop or edit substantial damage administrative procedures for the substantial damage or SDE process. They might need to create a debris management plan. They might need to build an SOP for what to do after a disaster. So thinking of these things during the resilience plan development stages can ensure that these overlapping processes are all cohesive. The second part of criteria 4 is to provide a clearly articulated timeline or phasing for plan implementation. Timelines for the project can be detailed with finite dates, or it can consist of a phasing plan that might not necessarily have to have specific dates for individual project completion. So this slide is just showing an example timeline. It's outlining the project information, such as the name and description, and then it has the current project status, And then on the far right-hand column is an estimated completion date for each of the proposed projects. This next example is, I wanted to include this to express that phased plans are also acceptable. You know, sometimes it can be difficult to put finite dates on projects when looking at, you know, the big picture and you're looking at community-wide resilience as a whole. So this example is showing that it's showing the proposed program as individual phases that are just smaller pieces of that larger overarching plan. They have details provided as to what's to be completed within each of the phase. And looking at the overall resilience plan in phases also allows the locality to break things down to more manageable pieces. So it doesn't seem as such a big overwhelming thing. Okay, so the final criteria for the resilience plan is to ensure that it's based on the best available science. The community should be providing a technically backed water resource analysis when available. Sea level rise projections and climate change data should be incorporated into the strategic approach. Storm surge data should also be included if it's available for your locality. And the community needs to be utilizing the most current flood maps. So for additional reference, I've included a few links on this slide. The first two links are for some easy to access resources for assistance in obtaining data to meet this criteria. Current flood maps can be found utilizing the Map Service Center. We do have sea level rise inundation zones if they're available for the locality on VFRIS. The third link here is actually just showing an example of a really extensive plan that was created by a locality that addresses sea level rise within their community. This is just an example of one community's approach to incorporating that information in building resilience for their community. It is not in any way trying to set a level of expectation for your submission. It's just a useful reference to see their approach in creating resiliency and prioritizing the reality of sea level rise for their community, because it is one of the major impacts for their specific community. The fourth and last link is for an interactive map and dashboard that was created to show the impacts of sea level rise in Northern Virginia. And I just wanted to include this example because it's a creative way to show the impacts of sea level rise within a community, but it also shows how a community can use outside plans or resources to get information to meet the criteria for their resilience plan. So this particular tool was not actually developed by the applying locality. It was just a tool that did include their community in the data, and so they used that data share. And another thing too is seeing different things like this that might, you know, spark ideas of different things or potential ideas or projects that your community might look at wanting to implement down the road with, you know, future funding opportunities. So this slide just shows a snapshot that I took from that last link for that interactive sea level rise map. This is showing the impact to Northern Virginia for a 1 foot rise in sea level. There's little dark teal blue spots that are along the waterways there. Up in the right-hand corner, you can change the sea level rise scenario from 1 foot to 3 feet to 5 feet. As you change the scenario, the numbers for the impacted parcels, acres, and property value are going to change to coincide with that new selection. But it's just a really interesting and interactive way for people to visualize those changes and how greatly it's going to impact their community. So this next slide is also just a snippet that I took from that same tool. This is their dashboard that was created as part of that same project. In this particular scenario, I selected a 5 foot sea level rise for what's the locality I picked? I think Fairfax County. You can see the impacts of that 5 foot sea level rise, and it shows you how many parcels are impacted, how many acres are impacted, and the property value that's impacted by that 5 foot scenario. So this is going to conclude my portion on the resilience plan roadmap. My hope is just that I was able to provide some clarification as to the requirements for the resilience plan, maybe provide some good examples, seeing how things have been done, maybe ideas for how you might want to approach or different things you might take out of that, and maybe some ideas that maybe you haven't even considered for your community. But I'm going to pass this back over to Angela, who is going to talk about where to find useful data.
Thank you, Brandy. So we have covered a lot of information today, and the application itself does require some information gathering on the front end, and we wanted to provide you where to find the data, basically. So these are the websites and resources available to you to acquire some of the pieces of information you'll need. It includes federal resources such as the Census Bureau, HUD, and FEMA. FEMA's National Risk Index is linked here. We also have a state resource available to you via the ADAPT VA Social Vulnerability Viewer. Some of the information may be found in your community plans, including the comprehensive plan, elements within the hazard mitigation plan, capital improvement plans. Your community may have a standalone floodplain management plan or any other applicable plans. We also suggest using other scientifically backed data sources if the information you need is not found in any of the sources listed. For both the capacity side of the application as well as the projects, you may have a need to obtain additional training in floodplain management, and we do have that available to you all through the FEMA L273 Managing Floodplain Development through the NFIP course. This training is geared for local officials responsible for administrating their local floodplain management ordinance. It is not restricted to the floodplain administrator. Any official within your community, whether they work in zoning, public works, board of supervisors, any official that has a role in floodplain management, this course may be beneficial for them. It includes various topics on the NFIP, flood insurance rate maps, flood insurance studies, and how to actually administer the ordinance and how to manage the NFIP within your community. This course is offered in Virginia at the end of this month, and registration does close tomorrow on January 14th. But this is a 4-day course that will occur on Monday, January 24th through Thursday, January 27th. And on Friday, we will have the Certified Floodplain Manager's exam. If you cannot make it to the January 24th offering, this course will be offered in other communities throughout the country, including the FEMA Emergency Management Institute in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Again, on Friday, January 28th, we will be proctoring the Certified Floodplain Managers exam, which is offered by the Association of State Floodplain Managers. It is also available online if you cannot make it to the January 28th or any of our future sessions where we're offering this exam. And again, I know we have covered a lot of ground today, but if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, the floor is now yours. You can unmute yourself or you can type any questions you may have in the chat. I'm also going to put our contact information up here in case any of you do not have it.
Angela,
Is
there is
there
a
a
question about
virtual?
COVID. You got it.
Yes. Yes, I see. Is there a virtual option for this given COVID? So the L273 course is actually developed by the Emergency Management Institute, and at this moment, they do not have a virtual offering specific for this course. However, as a region, the Region 3 states, we have developed a kind of introduction to floodplain management course that we are thinking about offering virtually again later on this year. But for right now, we have not decided on that. And this is the only offering available. Towards the end of this year, we may have another in-person L273 course available again as well, and hopefully COVID will not be as much of an issue by then. Great question, Matt. Okay, well, we're going to stay on the line until 2 o'clock in case you're thinking about your questions and just trying to formulate your ideas right now. But if not, we want to say thank you for joining us today. This presentation has been recorded and will be available on the DCR website, and we will follow up with training materials and resources from both the floodplain management session as well as the dam safety session as well.